everyone. I'm Rebecca Weber. This is your AMAC podcast, Better for America. If you're not getting your political news from AMAC, then you won't be informed on American politics. So be sure to download the AMAC app today. I am so thrilled to be back with you all, and especially excited to be joined today with Robert Charles, or Bobby Charles, as many of you know him. As a reminder to our listeners, you have served, Bobby, in all three branches of the federal government, 2 White Houses, Reagan and Bush 41, as well as the position of Assistant Secretary of State under George W. Bush. And so here we are at the start of a new Congress, 2 years left in the Biden White House, and many big cases are before the U.S. Supreme Court. We see the undermining of our military, Bobby, with wokeness undermining readiness, and our adversaries are seeming to get bolder. So we've got a lot to talk about today, but let me ask you first, as someone who ran a big part of the House Oversight Committee, how much can these congressional oversight committees get done? What authorities do they have? And can these committees really get to the truth on issues like the Hunter Biden laptop, political corruption at the Justice Department and the FBI, and the collapse of really any attempt to enforce rule of law at the border?
You know, honestly, Rebecca, that might be one of the most important questions that average Americans have on their minds today. You know, we've seen a government, and we've seen Republicans sliding a little bit, trying to get some kind of truth out of all this, and it's very hard. I mean, it's like nailing Jello to a wall. You're trying desperately to get the truth to stick, and you got an administration trying to make it not stick. So before I answer that, let me just say, I think honestly, this could be the most important 2 years of the last, 40, because we have a very weak president who our adversaries understand is very weak. We have a leftist push that is almost like it's an undercurrent, like an undertow in the country, and it's pulling us down. And I think that's why the next 2 years in oversight is going to be absolutely critical. So, interestingly, your question goes right to the heart of the matter, and that is that Mr. Jordan and a lot of the Republican conservatives have said, look, we cannot waste a minute. We have to form, and they have formed, a committee that is very much like the old church committee hearings, which was back in 1973. There was a big committee structured. They called it the church committee. It was dedicated to the idea that they would do a backward look and find out if the U.S. government, and in particular the CIA, had been spying on and abusing its powers in spying on average Americans. And they actually conducted 126 hearings, full committee hearings, another 40 subcommittee hearings. They interviewed something like 800 witnesses, and they just really pedal to the metal. They went on behalf of average Americans to find out if the government, our own government that we entrust with extraordinary powers, was coming after us. And in fact, this is very fitting, very timely to be doing the same thing again. So I actually will tell you, they have subpoena power. Normally, an oversight committee, I ran a portion of the oversight committee, but I also was part of something that we did as sort of a select or special committee dedicated to going after Waco. We interviewed 100 witnesses. We did 13 days of open hearings. Bottom line is, this is going to be a very tough moment, but they have given not just the Intelligence Committee, but the oversight committees and the special committee that Jim Jordan is chairing, they have given them the power to do subpoenas, to interview witnesses. They've already named names. They're looking for whistleblowers. They want to turn over documents. I think, quite honestly, the average American should stay tuned really closely, Rebecca, because what we're going to get is an intensive battle between a truth-seeking Congress and a truth-obscuring White House. And I think it's very likely that we will see cabinet members impeached on the House side. Already the open source evidence indicates that we've got an attorney general and a head of DHS that are not doing their jobs. So meaning not consistent with their oaths. So I think we're in a tough moment, but at the same time, sometimes it's the toughest moments that generate the hardest steel. And so maybe that's what we're about to get.
Very encouraging. Thank you, Bobby. I do want to shift slightly to another big question that our members sure have, and that is, we've just witnessed that we've got this very, very narrow majority in the U.S. House, only 222 seats in a chamber of 435. So that's going to make legislating difficult, even with the hard-won reforms or concessions that we just saw secured. So beyond oversight and educating the American public about how wrongheaded and really morally off track the Biden White House is, what else should be done to push for more fiscal sanity?
Yeah.
more energy production, and lower inflation, less spending. And if we can use these legislative powers, give us some examples how that is really done in order to turn the ship around.
Very important that you separate those two, Rebecca. And I think it's important for the average American and our AMAC membership to understand that there are two different things going on here. We have oversight, which is about education and truth seeking and accountability. And then we have these legislative powers. The House has the power of the purse. We have the power to decide what money will and will not be authorized and appropriated in the House. We also have the power, and this is a very interesting power. I mean, having done this for 5 years with Gingrich, with the Clinton administration as our direct, let's just say, adversary in the process, because they were also trying to obscure truth, not quite as dramatically as we're seeing today, but nevertheless. So what can you do? You can take authorizing legislation and you can force certain requirements into that legislation. So by way of example, there's an upcoming debate on the debt ceiling coming along. And Republicans have said, and the conservatives in the speaker's debate said, look, we need a real vote on the debt ceiling, and we're willing to not approve an increase in the amount of debt that the United States has. We're already at about $31 trillion. We're interested in potentially not approving that unless the president will give us some concessions, and the Democrats in the Senate will give us some concessions about fiscal responsibility. Well, there's a way that you take a piece of legislation and you now leverage this must-pass legislation so that it will have attached to it riders that are going to make the government more accountable. They just passed a piece of legislation, just this new Congress, saying that they would get rid of these 87,000. They will not allow the 87,000 new armed IRS agents. God knows why we need 87,000 armed IRS agents to continue to go forward. Well, you're going to have to get that through the Senate somehow. And the only way you're going to do that is to take must-pass legislation, appropriations bills, or key authorization bills, and say, we're going to attach this rider. And by the way, you're not going to get any money if you don't concede to the American people that we're not going to have this kind of abusive, runaway, unaccountable government. Now, the big part of it about this, Rebecca, is we're going to have a caucus, a Republican caucus, that holds the line. They need to hold together the way Nancy Pelosi very brutally held her caucus together. We have to do it out of goodwill and moral fiber. We have to say, no, we, the American people, put us here to bring this government under control. And we have to now hold together as a caucus to bring it under control. If the Republicans hold strong, they can push legislation that limits and even potentially rescinds some of the bad actions that occurred in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and that is some more good news. So let's pray that that moral fiber exists and that they do hold strong. Bobby, I want to shift again to get your thoughts on how you think Attorney General Merrick Garland should respond to the 10 classified documents that were found, including U.S. intelligence materials relating to Ukraine, Iran, and the U.K. Those were found in Biden's private office. Should Garland open a full-blown criminal investigation? And why is the leftist news media really downplaying this all, despite their vicious attacks against former President Donald Trump and the FBI's raid on Mar-a-Lago? It seemed that they were singing a whole different tune when the news broke about Donald Trump and confidential records. What should the Attorney General do here? How do you think this will unfold?
Well, let's say if we're going to be fair and honest about this, and we're not living in a double standard world, which unfortunately we are, but if we weren't, then if you're going to open a special prosecutor on Donald Trump, who opened up his house to let them come look at the documents that he had, and then they turned around and not only swarmed in with long guns and intimidation and 9 hours of turning the First Lady's closet upside down and everything else. A huge violation of the Fourth Amendment. I mean, this is still not settled, and the media is not talking about it. But this is a clearly unadulterated violation of the Fourth Amendment. Either you have a general warrant, which is illegal, or you have a specific warrant that they exceeded, and it's illegal. But now that they've done that, and now you discover in the private home, in the private office of Joe Biden. And by the way, these documents that were in Donald Trump's office it's exactly where he worked on them. It's just that they were left there. They were documents that presidents historically took documents back to write from, to protect themselves. It was a standard operating procedure. In fact, prior to Ronald Reagan, presidents invariably took them home. There was no Presidential Administration Act. After the Administrative Act was passed, because they wanted to put some of these documents in the archives, presidents had to take copies or had to get permission. By the way, a president of the United States can declassify documents. A vice president cannot. And so, Joe Biden, as vice president, snarfs away some of these documents, sticks them in he even on national television 2 days ago said he's putting them in a closet. Well, okay, at least they were in a closet, he said. Well, I'm glad they were in a closet. Is that where you put them to avoid them being discovered? After all, they were documents on Ukraine, and you've been accused of favoring your son who took millions of dollars out of Ukraine. So, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and what's good for the gander is good for the goose. And if there's going to be no investigation, and this may ultimately end in a zero indictment of Trump, even though I think that's what they had lined up, because it's very hard to indict somebody for something that the president and vice president, or when he was vice president of the United States, did. And you say it's legal on behalf of a Democrat, but illegal on behalf of a Republican. I think that's the very living definition of a double standard. So, I think it actually pisses Americans off. I think they look at it and they go, you know what? Stop downplaying it. When they first did the headlines, they said the documents were found in a office. No, they were found in the office of Joe Biden, who during a period of time when he was not vice president, had documents in his possession, unprotected, relating to the Ukraine, which now we know from the Biden laptop, Hunter Biden laptop, very much is involved in potential suspicious bribery and public corruption. So, I think this is transparent to most Americans. If you are going to put together a special prosecutor for a former president that you found absolutely nothing of significance in his home, you better put a special prosecutor on the current president who, as vice president, violated national security policy.
Yeah, it's more of the rules for thee and not for me. And I think the American people see through it and they understand. So interesting, too, Bobby, how these documents were found and discovered prior to midterm election day.
They were.
But only now is news reporting on it. More interesting stuff. Bobby, before we let you go, I know that you were close to a pioneering Apollo astronaut, Apollo 7's lunar module pilot, Walt Cunningham. Now, he recently passed away. He was an outspoken conservative. He'll be sorely missed. Tell us a little bit about what this special American hero did, the kind of man that he really was, and why all Americans should really honor him.
What a beautiful way to end this program. Sometimes we get discouraged and disgusted by the way our government is operating. And we feel that, where's the sign of hope? Where can we get some positive, reinforcement for the values that we hold? Walt Cunningham is a living embodiment of that. And I knew him very closely for the last 25 years, he and his wife, and just an amazing human being. So the nutshell version is that, as a matter of background, he was a poor kid that came out of Iowa, a big family, somewhere between 5 and 10 kids. I don't remember how many kids, had nothing. And his ticket out was to be join the Marine Corps, and to become a Marine Corps fighter pilot. And so he flew 54 combat missions in Korea. Came back, finished his college degree, had not had a college degree, finished his college degree, decided that he wasn't bad in physics, so he kept going and he got a master's in physics and almost completed a PhD in physics when the NASA program came along. And it's a very funny story. I mean, he was driving a car and he heard Alan Shepard launch into space, and he pulled over and he thought, God, that sounds exciting. I mean, imagine going into space. And a year later, by a twist of fate that I won't go into, he had an office down the hall from Alan Shepard. And here's where the rubber really meets the road. This guy, Walt Cunningham, humble soul, not a big ego, in a world of big egos, not a big ego, felt lucky as anything until the age of 90 when he just proposed. But he always felt lucky that God was on his shoulder and helped him get through stuff. The first Apollo mission had 3 astronauts on it who died in a tragic fire in 1967, January of 1967. Walt and his 2 crewmates were the backup crew for that launch. And so what happened is, a year later, Walt was on the review commission. They completely redesigned the capsule. In many ways, a lot of the astronauts say if that had not happened, and if Walt and others had not redesigned that capsule, we would have had a catastrophe on the way to the moon. But he was a very rigorous thinker, again, a scientific thinker, threw his whole body and mind into the idea of making it work. so that it would work well. And now I want you to just imagine, telescope for a minute what happened. John Kennedy, back in the early 60s, says we're going to, as a surrogate for nuclear war, we're going to have a space race with the Soviets. So they start the space race. Within a year, President Kennedy is assassinated. And then wind the clock ahead. In 67, you have this tragic fire, which kills 3 astronauts, worse in many ways than the Challenger in Columbia to the American psychology. America is on fire in the 1960s. There are riots everywhere. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. In June of 1968, Robert Kennedy, the presidential candidate, brother of the president, attorney general, gets assassinated. Now in October of 1968, Apollo 7, which is really the first next manned Apollo, is about to launch. And I talked many, many times with Walt, and he said, look, I knew everything was on us. We had to have a perfect mission. We had to launch perfectly, and we had to come home perfectly. And here's the deal, Rebecca, they did that. And I asked him one time, would you ever have any fear, Walt? I mean, the last crew had died in the capsule, and, this is the first Apollo mission. There'd never been one before this. And you're going to go up and he goes, you know what, Bobby? A lot of us who served in the military made a decision that our lives were worth risking and losing, if necessary, for this great country. And he said, we never looked back. None of the Apollo astronauts ever looked back. Our view was, put me to the mission, get me a chance to get in the game, and pull me off the bench and put me in the game, and I will do my level best. And that's exactly what he did. He did that all his life. And even astronauts like Buzz Aldrin, who wrote a piece yesterday in the Washington Post, said, if it had not been for Walt Cunningham, if it had not been for Apollo 7 and the courage of that crew, we would never have walked on the moon. So a good man, but also a great inspiration.
Yeah, great story, Bobby. Thank you. You inspire us really to carry forward their legacy of courage and honor and love for our country. Bobby, thank you so much for being with us. I really look forward to having you back with us real soon. Always a joy and a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to be talking to you and talking to our members.
Amen. And to everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. I'm Rebecca Weber. Until next time, have a great day, everyone.